I can't help but to think the reading from Genesis with the story of Isaac and Rebekah, that they would have appreciated, especially Rebekah, who seems to be much more prominent in this story, which is true, actually, throughout Isaac and Rebekah. Quite interestingly, one could say that both Rebekah and Isaac have equal roles, or if anything, Rebekah actually has a larger role in this story of the patriarchs and matriarchs here in Genesis. But I think that she could really appreciate the prayer of Jesus, the Lord's Prayer that he taught us. We've been using the contemporary Lord's Prayer because it's a much more accurate translation. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, is a little different, to say the least, from what actually, which Jesus said, which is much more in line with the contemporary. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. And I've had us use this because goodness knows this is a time in which we are praying to God to save us from this time of trial. Whether it's the virus or that we maybe finally are facing the great sin of this nation, which is racism. Whatever it is, or all of those things, plus many individual things that we're all dealing with. A lot of folks are dealing with unemployment right now, right? There's some of you who thought that you might be starting a family or expanding your family right now, and suddenly it doesn't seem like a great idea to do that. We're uncertain about whether or not children will be able to return to school, and that causes a great deal of anxiety for parents. I mean, how are we supposed to work if that can't happen, right? And so that looms over our whole existence, really, as we just, it seems like, barrel through July on our way to August. Or maybe you're an educator and wondering, how many different ways can I, it's like the 57 flavors of ice cream at Baskin-Robbins, except this isn't good tasting, right? But it's like 57 flavors of classroom. Maybe you've been working from home and you're beginning to miss your colleagues. Save us from a time of trial. This is something that Rebekah knew. She experienced barrenness, and then while still in her womb, the children still in her womb, she experiences this difficult pregnancy. And then, sure enough, when they come out, they could not be more different than night or day. And we can have that among our children, right? That they can just be quite different from one another. Now, that doesn't always mean that they then can't get along. But in the case of Jacob and Esau, they didn't. And for some of you, you share Rebekah's heartbreak. You know this had to have been difficult. I mean, while everyone else has children upon children upon children. In fact, right before this, earlier in the chapter, we read that after Sarah passed away, Abraham married again. And there's this laundry list of children that descended from he and his second wife. And then, so women all around Rebekah were having, just gobs of children, right? Some of us come from these families, right? Grandfathers and great-grandfathers who were one of 10, one of 12. And she has these two. She has only two. And they're constantly fighting. They fought from the moment before they were born, And they fought throughout her whole life. Isaac seems, I don't know, in this story, a little less aware, right? And if we kept reading the chapters after this, where we have that great story again of where Jacob, when his father's really old, will put wool on him so that his mostly blind father, who can barely see and knows the world by touch, touches Jacob, the story goes, and thinks he's touching Esau. So this isn't the last time that Jacob is going to steal the birthright from Esau. But Isaac, in these stories, you kind of get the impression is just not really aware. But Rebekah is. Save us from this time of trial and deliver us from evil. The sad thing about this story is that Jacob and Esau will never reconcile. I love British television. In part, I like British television, which is also why my children don't like to watch it with me, is that it doesn't always end with a happy ending. Kind of the general criticism of American television is, in movies, is it always ends with a happy ending. It works out in the end. But if you ever hear a British commentator about American television, they'll say, well, that's just not realistic. And usually kind of the argument back and forth across the great pond is that Brits go, that doesn't recognize life, and Americans go, exactly. I don't go to watch TV and watch the movies to experience real life. I go to feel good about myself. It's kind of this very different kind of cultural relationship with this. I think that that's probably true of plays also. Except right now, we have this great play, this great musical, right? Hamilton. If you haven't watched it, it's based on a true story, so I feel like I can share this with you. If you don't want to hear this, just put your fingers in your ear. But Hamilton dies. That's kind of unusual for an American story, right? He dies young in a fight. But this story in Genesis doesn't end happily ever after. I mean, to a great extent, there's Abraham's story does, right? He not only has Isaac, he has Ishmael, he has all these other children by his second wife. He's got descendants upon descendants in his own lifetime. But Isaac and Rebekah's story doesn't end happily ever after. They will die seeing their children divided. And this is one of the things that I love about the Holy Scriptures, is that while there's some real fantastical parts of it that don't translate to us in our modern culture, there's a lot about these stories that do. That people go through difficult times, and they're not solved quickly or easily. But what do we see Rebekah do? What do we see this great matriarch of our faith do? She turns to God in prayer. She turns to God in prayer. And she also then seeks ways in which to reduce the amount of violence that's going to happen. She sends Jacob, her favorite. She doesn't send off Esau, who's closest to his father. She sends off Jacob. Because central to the story is that she doesn't want them fighting. More so, she doesn't want them killing each other. There's a practicalness to what Rebekah does that I think that we miss. You see, sometimes we face real difficulty and we are just going to fight it tooth and nail. And we've got a vision for how this is going to go. And we're going to get angry. We're going to barter. We're going to get depressed. And instead, maybe we need to be like Rebekah and get practical. Sometimes you're just in a bad situation. And there's a lot of it that's out of your control. And that's certainly true, I think, for all of our lives right now. But within that, you can control how you respond to it. And within that, you can either make it worse or you can make it better. And Rebekah made a really awful situation better. Unlike Cain and Abel, which the story parallels, she does something that Adam and Eve don't catch. And she intervenes and stops her sons from killing each other. And that's the second lesson that I think that we can learn from the story of Jacob and Esau. You may have people in your life that there just doesn't ever seem to be reconciliation. And while Christ calls us to the ministry of reconciliation, we also know that Christ doesn't call us to perfection. Christ very much acknowledges throughout the Holy Gospels that we fall short. And then that Christ sits with us within that. And so I sometimes hear from people to go, well, it's family, or we grew up together, and they just have to make the relationship work. And it just never does. I'll hear it from spouses who are in abusive relationships. I made a vow. I have to stay. No. This story ends with Jacob and Esau agreeing to no longer inflict violence upon each other and to go their separate ways. And while we know that the perfect ideal would have been reconciliation, sometimes it's okay to do things to stop the violence. If you can't reconcile, then it's okay to do things to stop the violence, to stop the enmity, the anger that keeps happening. It doesn't always work out. And that's okay. Generations will continue to be blessed. Jacob in particular, who is not the better of the two men in many ways in these stories as you read more, right? He's constantly from the moment he grabs Esau's heel to this story over stew and that he's going to let his brother starve, to then that he's dressing up in wool to fool his father to get the inheritance. Jacob does a lot of awful things. And yet we're going to hear stories going forward of his family being blessed and his people being blessed, and eventually to the promised land. My point is that we get stuck in this idea that we have to be perfect in order for God to bless us, and we don't. God doesn't expect us to be perfect. The scriptures remind us over and over again, only God is perfect. And so show yourself a little grace, and maybe show the other person a little grace. I mean, sometimes by backing off for a period of time, you then can come back together. But sometimes if you just let the anger go and the animosity go, and you don't become close again, but you no longer have those things between you, that's a win. Save us from a time of trial and deliver us from evil. The point of all these various things that we can tease out of the story is that times of trial are not new. But we can lean on our faith. I won't go into a whole nother sermon on the gospel, but I'll just say this, right? The good soil. Have you been making good soil in your life? St. Teresa of Avila talks about our faith being like a garden in which it's all there, but we gain more out of it as we till it, as we work it. It's a beautiful image. Have you been leaning on your faith during this time? While godly play does its level best over Zoom, are you still reading stories to your children? Are you sharing your faith with them? Because when you baptized them, you promised to do that. So while we're out of church, do your best. Perfection is not the goal here. Just do your best. Have you taken time to pray? If not, there's the Pray As You Go app. I think a lot of us have trouble reading right now, right? Concentrating. That's okay. The Pray As You Go app is about that you can download, or you can go to the website Pray As You Go, and it's done by a group of Jesuits out of England. It's about anywhere between 12 to 14 minutes. It has a little music, a reading of Scripture for the day, and then step by step kind of walks you through a reflection. Maybe throw those headphones on and go for a walk. Or if it's too hot to go for a walk, lock yourself in a closet to get away from your family and put those headphones on and tune into the Pray As You Go app. There's many other resources, and if you would like them, please be in touch and we can talk about it. I want to help you during this time of trial. But more than anything, what I want to help you is to find ways to better connect you to your faith so that, like Rebekah, you can walk through this time of trial. Amen.